Good morning, everyone in Washington. Good evening to our friends in Asia. Thank you so much for joining today's CSIS virtual event on Taiwanese perspectives on the United States and China. My name is Henrietta Levin. I'm a senior fellow here at CSIS with the Freeman Chair in China Studies, and I am thrilled to be moderating today's event, launching the 2026 American Portrait Survey in Taiwan, which is a flagship project of Academia Sinica. The survey's findings shed light on a wide range of issues that I think a lot of us spend a lot of time thinking about, such as Taiwanese perspectives on U.S. Taiwan relationships, on China's intentions toward Taiwan, but also Taiwan's policies related to defense spending, Taiwan's strategies of deterrence, and the credibility of the U.S. security commitment to Taiwan, and a wide range of additional urgent questions. So I'm really thrilled to be joined by a very impressive panel of experts who held responsibility for the conceptualization and execution of the 2026 American Portrait Survey in Taiwan. And so we are very lucky to hear today from Wen-Chin Wu, Research Fellow with the Institute of Political Science at Academia Sinica, David W.F. Huang, Executive Director of the Taiwan Heritage Foundation, Hsin-Hsin Pan, Associate Research Fellow with the Institute of Sociology at Academia Sinica, and James Lee, Assistant Research Fellow with the Institute of European and American Studies at Academia Sinica. So we're really lucky to have so many folks who have been digging into this data, who brought it to life and are going to tell us about the results for 2026. So let me turn the floor with no further ado to Wen-Chin for an introduction of the American Portrait Survey.
Yeah, thank you, Ariana. It's an honor to be here again, and thank you for attending this event. My name is Wen-Chin, and today we are going to present our latest result of our American Portrait Survey. And I'm going to make a short introduction about our survey, and David will talk about American security commitment, and Hsin-Hsin will talk about some policy issues, and James will also talk about how Taiwanese people conceptualize or perceive U.S. Taiwan policy. So just give you a quick introduction about American Portrait Survey. So about 5 years ago, we tried to understand how Taiwanese public opinion on U.S.-Taiwan relations, because we noticed that there are a couple of national representative surveys on how Taiwanese perceive cross-strait relations, but we do not have a project that specifically focus on U.S.-Taiwan relations. So that's why we think that we should have a survey on this. So since 2021, we conduct telephone survey every year with national representative samples. And our survey actually is commissioned to the Election Study Center at National Zhengzi University. And each year we try to focus on how Taiwanese perceive U.S.-Taiwan relations. And then we have been conducted for six waves. And the latest wave is conducted January this year. And if you are interested in our data or our questionnaire, you can go to our website. It's www.americanportrait.tw. Yeah, so basically our survey focus on two types of perspective on U.S.-Taiwan relations. The first one is about U.S. skepticism, because which means that the U.S. may or may not be fully reliable or consistent with its support for Taiwan, especially in potential military conflict with China. So that's very the dominant perspective in Taiwan in the past few years. So some people are very skeptical about U.S. commitment to Taiwan, especially under U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity to cross-strait relations. So that's a very prevalent perspective among some Taiwanese respondents. However, there is also another kind of email. So in that sense, it is a U.S. dependence. It means that Taiwan's security or Taiwan's foreign relations may depend on U.S.-Taiwan relations. So under that perspective, it means that Taiwan should heavily rely on U.S. support, particularly for security, diplomacy, and international support. So our survey just focused mainly on those two types of email. And in our survey, we try to design a set of questions to focus on how people evaluate U.S.-Taiwan relations based on those two perspectives. And there is one key question in our survey, which is about how Taiwanese people perceive U.S. credibility. So since 2021, in each wave of surveys, we asked the following question. Do you agree or disagree that U.S. is a credible country? So in Chinese, it means that 您同不同意美国是讲信用的国家? So we may need to discuss what does it mean 讲信用, but we try to specifically focus on Taiwanese perception of U.S. credibility. So we chose to use the word 讲信用, but we can talk about that later. And David will also talk about the implication of this question later. So, but let me show you some key results of our survey. So this is the trend of Taiwanese perception on U.S. credibility. So in 2021, it's about 45% of respondents indicate that they agree or strongly agree that the U.S. is a credible country or a country that will stick to its own word. But it declined, the support or the agreement declined since 2021. And it increased a little bit in 2024, but it decreased again. And you can see that in our latest wave of data, now only 34% of respondents indicate that the U.S. is a credible country. So this is some empirical evidence about the first version of email. So more than 60% of Taiwanese people think that the U.S. may not be a credible country. But at the same time, we also asked about how Taiwanese people evaluate China's credibility. And you can see it's surprising low since 2021, but it's also surprising that after 2025, Taiwanese people's belief in China's credibility increased from 11% point to 17%. So we can also discuss this result later, but you can see that there is a contrast between Taiwanese perceptions on U.S. credibility and China's credibility. And you may also wonder then what's the partisan difference or what's the partisan coverage influence on the perception of credibility of two major powers. So this is the political landscape in Taiwan. We know that there are about 30% of respondents who are supportive of the incumbent party, the DPP. And there's also about 20% of respondents supportive of the KMT, Kuomintang, and about 10% of respondents supportive of the TPP, Minzongdang. And about more than 35% of respondents are nonpartisans. And this is the long-term trend conducted by National Zhenjiang University as well. And our survey data shows a similar pattern in which we have a slightly lower support rate for a nonpartisan, but it's also about 33%. And you can see that in our survey, we find that there is a strong partisan credibility regarding partisan support or partisan belief in U.S. credibility. 60% of our respondents think that the U.S. is a credible country, while only less than 10% of respondents from the KMT think that the U.S. is credible. On the other hand, we can also see that among KMT supporters, they are more supportive of China's credibility, while the DPP supporters have a very low evaluation about China's credibility. So we can see that there is a strong partisan divide among DPP and KMT or other party supporters regarding the U.S. and China's credibility. And I will turn it to David to talk about more implications about this result. Yeah, David.
Oh, thank you for having me here. I would like to talk a little bit about the cross-step analysis between the credibility of China and the United States vis-a-vis the belief in the U.S. security assurance and belief in the China military threat. As you can see, the next page, the data shows that Those who believe that think that U.S. is a credible country, like 81% to 91% of those who believe that U.S. is a credible country will believe in the U.S. Security assurance. Whereas by contrast, those who strongly agree or strongly somewhat agree that China is non-credible countries, there will be a 60% to 42% of the people who believe in China's military threat. What this pattern seems to be very similar across the different wave of our survey from 2022 to 2025. We also asked the people to evaluate the whether the China threats increase or decrease, whether the U.S. Security protections increase or decrease. If you cross-tab between the agreement with the U.S. is a credible country or China is a credible country, exactly the same things that happen is that whenever you think that the U.S. is a credible country, it's more likely you believe in this U.S. security commitment. Whereas that if you don't believe that China is a credible country, that you are more likely to believe in the China threat. So in other words, I mean, there's a sense that, credibility is more associated with the security assurance, whereas the incredibilities or non-credible countries or perception of non-credible countries are likely to associate with the military threat. And we can discuss why this is the case. Maybe the threat is associated with the incredible or inconsistencies or unpredictabilities about the person or the countries. Now we turn to the next page. So this is what do you think that the U.S. will help Taiwan if China attack Taiwan? And as you can see, there's a very, very prevalent partisan influence in here, whereas the DPP supporters are more likely to think that the U.S. will come to defend Taiwan, whereas the KMT supporters are significantly less likely to think that U.S. will defend Taiwan. So I think the pattern seems to be there's somewhat that they are influenced by the party ID, and that's the one that we have to do the further investigations. And next page will show that whenever that the U.S. government would like to assure Taiwan that they would like to defend Taiwan, what kinds of the short signals that would work for Taiwanese people? So if the U.S. president publicly commit to defend Taiwan, how likely do you think that U.S. would deploy force to help Taiwan? And the second question is that the U.S. recently passed a relevant bills about the security assurance of Taiwan. What does this indicate the likelihood of the U.S. to deploy force to help Taiwan? And you can see the data. It seems to be quite interesting that equally that when the president makes a public statement or public pledge to defend Taiwan, 66% of the Taiwanese people believe that the U.S. will intervene in the case of China attack of Taiwan. Whereas when Congress passed a relevant bill to protect Taiwan, 64% of the people in Taiwan would think that the U.S. would come to intervene whenever China attack Taiwan. So I think it shows that not just a presidential guarantee, so presidential assurance is important, but also in terms of Congress passing the relevant bill to protect Taiwan, that would also serve the purpose. Next. So in the previous wave of the survey, we asked a different kind of the signals that U.S. government may send to Taiwanese people. And we try to ask Taiwanese people to evaluate that whether when that signal occurs, does it mean that U.S. is more likely or less likely to intervene in case of a China attack? And you can see that no, across the board that usually it make it very clear that actions speak louder than words. Now, the military patrol, whenever you warship patrol or fighter jet patrol along the Taiwan Strait, that would, 68% of the people in Taiwan see that signal could be very, very important for them to think that U.S. would intervene in case of China attack. Whereas, of course, that the presidential statements or the president's public guarantees that could be also very, very effective to make Taiwanese believe that the U.S. would intervene in the futures. Whereas the arms sales is a little bit lower, but about 60% of the Taiwanese people would think that the U.S. signal could be very, very valid for them to think that the U.S. would intervene in the coming futures. So with that, I think that I will come to stop my presentation. So maybe I'll turn it to Hsin-Hsin.
Sorry, Hsin-Hsin, you're muted.
Okay, I'll take over the hotly debated issues in Taiwan. The three issues regarding the arms sales and TSMC investment in the U.S. for unwillingness to fight. Arms sales are involved with the U.S. agenda for Taiwanese spending on that issue. So the first one, support for the purchasing U.S. arms. Statistically, almost all of DPP supporters are in favor of U.S. arms sales, while about 2/3 of the TPP supporters and less than half of the KMT supporters are on board with it. That makes U.S. arms sales get stuck in Taiwan. DPP is the sitting government, which tries real hard to push the agenda. But together, KMT and DPP, and the largest and the second largest opposition parties, respectively, take control of the majority of the Taiwanese Congress. So, Pan Blue Camp is the major threat on the way for the Taiwan's purchase of U.S. arms sales, and that makes the progress of the U.S. arms sales agenda at speed progress at a glacial speed. Next page, please. And if we take a closer look at the breakdown over the waves, is that has taken place over time. The trend does not change over the last two waves for the KMT, and then we witness a slight increase for DPP, which is already an all-out supportive of the agenda. So it is the KMT gets the issue. Actually, is the major reason why the U.S. arms sale agenda does not make progress in the Congress. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, oftentimes Taiwan is questioned by whether we're willing to fight for ourselves. Overall, the statistics look great. We can see that over different surveys, done by different credible academic institutions and or government think tanks, we present pretty much the same trend that an overwhelming percentage of Taiwanese are all for fighting, defending our own country, defending Taiwan when fend off the security threat. Of course, the data, traditional direct questioning surveys are questioned by social desirability bias. So we try to input some experimental surveys on different scenarios. So if China attacks Taiwan, are you willing to resist at all costs? We use this question as our benchmark. Then we move on to change the scenarios. We involve the U.S. strategic ambiguity policies, which has been lasted for decades. Well, so we put baseline plus U.S. does not deploy forces to help Taiwan, and another scenario is U.S. deploys forces to help Taiwan. So one is for strategic ambiguity, the other is for strategic clarity. Move on, next. So the results show that the percentage of willingness to fight at all costs, still we see it is still for the DPP supporters to drive up the willingness to fight. So on the surface, So overall, the figures is generally the high percentage is driven by DU supporters, and it's drawback by the pink blue camps of KMT and TPP. Next slide, please. So then we put the with strategic ambiguity and strategic clarity into the back to the picture. If the U.S. comes and U.S. not, again we see DPP supporters are willing to defend Taiwan regardless of the change of the scenarios, whether the United States come to Taiwan's rescue or not. And we see the KMT and DPP supporters are extremely sensitive to the change of the scenario. So they back down. So in other words, when it comes to deterrence, KMT and DPP supporters are the target to respond the expected deterrent behavior when it comes to willingness to fight. Next slide. And another hotly debated issue is TSMC investment in the United States. Here we have one chip investment, two interpretations in Taiwan. Again, a talk war between two narratives across two party camps. One is Silicon Shield that TSMC importance increases the likelihood the U.S. would defend Taiwan, and the other is quite the opposite, that because TSMC invests in the United States, that would decreases the likelihood of U.S. military defense of Taiwan, that invites war, so that's called Silicon Field. Next. So overall, the data shows that it's in a talk war. Again, just like the U.S. arms sales, Taiwan is pretty much trapped in half and half situation. Next slide, please. And if we further break down like across the party, and we find out each linkage between TSMC investment in the U.S. and U.S. security commitment is strong for both two camps. Is that DPP supporters assign positive values, while KMT supporters obviously believe otherwise. So it is for the Silicon Shield to win the heart of the DPP supporters when KMT supporters stand by the Silicon Field narratives. And given the TPP supporters are shrinking across all surveys, we expect that it is winning the TPP supporters. That will be a major task for KMT and DPP in the next in the following elections to come. So for the first time in Taiwan's political history, next slide, please. So we can find out again, we consistently show polarized view about the impact of TSMC investments as well as U.S. arms sales to the likelihood to help Taiwan across the party time. And for the first time in Taiwan's political history, to align with the U.S. agenda or not has become a clear political cleavage in Taiwan. That never happens before because align with the U.S. agenda has always been a partisan consensus across different camps. So we expect more talk of war over critical issues in Taiwanese politics for many, many years to come. Next, we move on to James Lee.
So the next set of questions that we'll be kind of focusing on have to do with how the Taiwanese respondents view the U.S. position on Taiwan status at more of a legal level. So the One China policy is distinct from the One China principle in the sense that, so right now I'm not talking about the Taiwanese perception of the policy, but what the policy actually is. One of the key differences between the One China policy and the One China principle is that under the One China policy, even though the United States recognizes only one Chinese government, the United States does not recognize Taiwan as being part of China, and the U.S. view is that Taiwan's sovereignty is undetermined. So the U.S. doesn't see Taiwan as either being independent or as a part of China. It's in this intermediate category of having an undetermined status. And so for those of us who work on the One China policy, we often have to preface our research the way that I just did by saying that the One China policy is not the same as the One China principle. But when you look at the data in terms of how that position is perceived by the Taiwanese, you see this interesting finding, which is that very few Taiwanese confuse one China policy and one China principle. So when you present respondents with these options, do you think the U.S. position is that Taiwan is a part of the People's Republic of China, that Taiwan is a country, or that Taiwan's status is undetermined? The respondents are mainly split between those who think that the U.S. considers Taiwan to be undetermined and that the U.S. thinks Taiwan is a country. So what we find is that among DPP supporters, a substantial majority, 63.4%, identify U.S. policy as considering Taiwan to be a country. Among KMT supporters, a substantial proportion, even a majority, thinks that the U.S. considers Taiwan to be undetermined. And that's a surprising finding. I didn't think that there would be such strong partisan difference in terms of views on whether or not the U.S. considers Taiwan to be undetermined, but that is borne out by our evidence. And also among TPP supporters, you find they have roughly similar views compared to KMT supporters, in that most of them think that the U.S. considers Taiwan to be undetermined. But generally, the split among the respondents is between those who think that U.S. policy considers Taiwan to be a country and those who think that U.S. policy is that Taiwan is undetermined. Very few respondents overall confuse one China policy and one China principle. Next slide, please. And so breaking the data down, not by partisanship, but by self-reported political identity, if we ask respondents to identify as Taiwanese, as Chinese, or as both, we find that respondents with exclusive Taiwanese identity are more likely to think of the United States as considering Taiwan to be a country, whereas respondents with either exclusive or dual Chinese and Taiwanese identity are more likely to think of U.S. policy as considering Taiwan to be undetermined. Next slide, please. And in this slide, we're presenting the data on how respondents view the change of language and how the United States talks about unilateral changes to the status quo. So the national security strategy of the Trump administration changed the verb opposes in reference to unilateral changes to the status quo to does not support. And a number of analysts working in this field were concerned that this would signal a weakening U.S. commitment to defend Taiwan. And yet what we find is that across all partisan groups, Taiwanese respondents did not think that this policy signaled this phrasing, I should say, of U.S. policy signaled any concrete policy changes. So the purple bar represents the proportion of respondents who think that U.S. policy is unchanged. So there are different ways of interpreting this. The one could just be that these subtle nuances of language opposes, does not support, even though they may seem quite significant to analysts, may not seem as significant to the general public. Another could be that the public may be thinking of the U.S. phrasing in terms of Chinese pressure on the United States to saying the U.S. opposed Taiwan independence. And so the fact that the U.S. changed the word oppose to does not support could signal a deliberate attempt to signal continuity in terms of U.S. policy. There are different ways of interpreting what exactly this means to Taiwanese respondents, but it is striking that across all partisan groups, most respondents do not think that this change of phrasing really signals a difference in policy. Next slide, please. And if we look across a kind of different way of breaking down the data by political identity, you find the same thing. So that among all different groups, if you break it down by political identity, that the modal category is to say that the U.S. policy does not seem to be changed in this change of phrasing. Next slide, please. And so this slide presents our findings on what respondents think about the nature of the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. So at a fundamental level, do respondents see Taiwan and China as being part of the same country? So the overall pool of the data is found at the bottom. So we find that 78.4% of respondents say Taiwan and China do not belong to the same country, and only 15.5% think that Taiwan and China do belong to the same country. So there's a clear and strong majority in favor of the view that Taiwan and China are not the same country. And as you might expect, this proportion is particularly strong among DPP supporters. But what's also quite interesting is that if you look at the KMT supporters, there's even a slender majority, 51.2% of respondents who support the KMT don't think of Taiwan and China being part of the same country. So their views on the status quo differ substantially from the official party platform on the 1992 consensus. And we found this not just in this wave of the survey, but I believe 2 or 3 years ago, we asked the same question and we had the same results. So this is not an anomaly of this particular data set. This is actually a consistent finding that we've had. And based on self-reported political identity, those who identify as exclusively Taiwanese, as you might expect, think that Taiwan and China do not belong to the same country. And those who have exclusively Chinese identity, interestingly, those who have exclusively Chinese identity aren't necessarily strongly in favor of the view that Taiwan and China are part of the same country. So only 49.7% of respondents who identify as only Chinese think of Taiwan and China as being part of the same country. As many as 47.8% of respondents with only Chinese identity in Taiwan still think of Taiwan and China as not being the same country. And those with both Chinese and Taiwanese political identity, among those respondents, as much as 58.1% of those respondents don't think that Taiwan and China are part of the same country. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, these are our overall results. There's been a declining but a polarized belief in U.S. credibility. As you may recall from the previous slide, there's been some fluctuation from year to year in terms of how credible the U.S. is considered to be in Taiwan. And it's dipped recently, not to historic lows, but there is some fluctuation, and it's gone down in the most recent couple waves of the survey. But perceptions of U.S. credibility overall are heavily driven by partisanship, and beliefs in U.S. credibility are highly correlated with belief in U.S. security commitments and the military threat posed by the People's Republic of China. On U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, supporters of the DPP favor U.S. arms sales, and their supporters tend to have a high expectation or a high hope of U.S. defense of Taiwan in the event of a Taiwan contingency. And across multiple surveys, the Taiwanese public's willingness to fight remains robust. On TSMC, the public is generally split on whether TSMC's investments serve as a silicon shield or as a hollowing out, and with implications for the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan. And the understanding of U.S. policy. So the two results I presented earlier on how the U.S. position on Taiwan sovereignty is perceived by Taiwanese respondents, and how the change of language in national security strategy reflects signals U.S. commitments to defend Taiwan. So arguably, the respondents in Taiwan see these issues very differently from analysts outside of Taiwan. So oftentimes there's a conflation between one China policy, one China principle. The change of language from opposed to does not support is interpreted to be a sign of a potential weakening of the U.S. commitment to Taiwan. But we find that within Taiwan itself is the exact opposite in terms of how those policies are perceived. And our findings on the status quo are that most Taiwanese do not see Taiwan and China as being part of the same country, and that's consistent across multiple ways with the survey, including the finding that even among KMT supporters, there's a slender majority, over 50%, that don't think Taiwan and China are part of the same country. So with that, I think I brought our slides to a conclusion, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for an incredibly engaging analysis. It's really fascinating to dive into the newest data. I may just abuse my moderator's privilege to ask a couple questions, and then we already have a few questions from the audience for folks watching at home. If you haven't already submitted a question and would like to, there's a button on the event page for you to do that. But in the meantime, while folks are still getting in their questions, I actually wanted to briefly go back to David. just to start, because I think the data you were discussing on arms sale, on the way in which different forms of U.S. security engagement with Taiwan are or are not reassuring vis-a-vis U.S. commitment to defend Taiwan is really interesting. Because it looked like arms sales, which I think many people would think of as the most concrete and significant form of U.S. support to Taiwan's defense, seems to actually resonate a little bit less. And I wonder if you have thoughts about how that shakes out. I mean, my assumption would be that we're looking at something maybe to say that a portion of the Taiwanese population view arms sales to Taiwan maybe as a sign that the U.S. wants Taiwan to be more self-sufficient in its defense, whereas, presidential statements of support or military patrol, even though they're less operationally relevant, they're more clear in signaling a U.S. role. But how should we interpret that bifurcation in the data?
Well, I think your guess is probably right. What the Taiwanese perceive, military patrol is actions. And whenever you have the U.S. warship around or pass through the Taiwan Strait, you have the U.S. fighter jet patrol around the Taiwan. That's a reassuring sign for Taiwanese people. Most of the people, that's what you can see that 68% or 69% of the Taiwanese people believe that's a credible is a very, very credible signal for the U.S. intention to defend Taiwan. Whereas arms sales, I would say, is a bit ambiguous because it's only about the 50 to 60% of the people who believe that that's a signal that the U.S. intend to defend Taiwan. Why this is the case, that maybe your guess is correct, is that whenever you have a more arms sale to Taiwan, that means that Taiwan should shoulder itself more, and the more that Taiwan shoulder itself in terms of defense, the less likely that the U.S. would defend Taiwan, and that's also explained why this is the case.
It's really, really interesting. Just to maybe take a step back, would pose a question to the full panel regarding change over time, because it does seem like on certain data points, as James highlighted in his conclusion, we have seen significant trends unfold over the course of this survey year on year. But in some cases, positions seem to be quite sticky, really, I guess one could say, regardless of the external environment in which folks are thinking about their positions. And then just as an addendum to that question, if I'm getting this right, I think that the data for this survey would have been collected pretty soon after the announcement of a new U.S. arms sale to Taiwan. So I wonder how kind of the timing of the data collection might play into these perspectives, if you have any thoughts on just what was going on at the time that might be weighing particularly heavily on your respondents' minds as they engaged with this material. And then again, just more broadly, what stood out to you, what surprised you or didn't about change over time, about continuity over time in these perspectives. Maybe we can go back to Wen-Chin and hear from the full panel.
Thank you, Rihanna. So I think for this question, as you indicate that the position on supportive U.S. arms sale is sticky. So, but there's a strong partisan divide. And because in the past few years, U.S. has approved a lot of arms sales to Taiwan. So I don't think Taiwanese people are particularly sensitive to one or the other arms sale because it's several arms sale bills to Taiwan. So in that sense, Taiwanese respondents may be less sensitive to the new arms sales to Taiwan. So I think that's also why in the past few years, the position do not change significantly over time. So I think that may, but overall, I think, Taiwanese people support U.S. arms sale to Taiwan. So this is 70% of respondents indicate that they are supportive of U.S. arms sale. But the issue is about the partisan divide. And as David mentioned, that it also shows how people think about the the role of U.S. arms sale, because for some people they think that arms sale indicate U.S. credible signal to Taiwan security, but for other party supporters they think that actually U.S. arms sale will decrease the U.S. likelihood to help Taiwan, just like you mentioned. So I think that's the overall pattern. Thank you.
James, what would you add?
So, as I recall, we never collected the data like right in the middle of some major announcement. So we never had a natural experiment where half of the respondents received the kind of survey questionnaire before and after a major event. So we aren't really able to test what these kinds of events, what kind of impact they might have on respondents' views of the situation. But I mean, I think that there are aspects of U.S. policy that are, as Wen-Chin just said, that have been kind of consistent over time and ones that are more subject to short-term fluctuations. And in terms of the contrast between military patrols and perceptions of what arms sales signal, as David mentioned, the arms sales themselves are ambiguous signal because it's not clear if that means that the U.S. is planning on entering a potential conflict with China and fighting alongside Taiwan, or if that means that that Taiwan is expected to fight on its own, because the arms sales could be useful in both scenarios. So that's a mixed signal in terms of what it indicates to Taiwanese respondents. But the fact that the arms sales themselves, because that's been such a consistent aspect of U.S. policy over time, so we kind of see that the perception of that is relatively stable.
Right. David, anything you would add on views evolving over time?
When the signal is become a constant practice, the signal become less salient for the people to perceive. Whenever you have a high-level official visit Taiwan, that could be something that's a very strong signal to Taiwanese people that U.S. intention to safeguard Taiwan, but it's not really very often that the high-level official of the U.S., high-level U.S. official visit Taiwan. So I think it all depends on whether the frequencies of the signal you send. If you send a signal regularly, it could become that for the signal receiver will see it as a fatigue. So that's maybe that the marginal utilities decline whenever you have a regular signals. And of course, I think arms sale is a very, very important subject for Taiwan, because that is not just about the signals; it's about the substance. It's a substance that that U.S. is willing to provide sufficient self-defense articles in order for Taiwanese to defend itself. So I think it's also important to understand that arms sale is not just about signal; it's a substance.
A great point. So I want to go out to our audience questions because we have a few good comments from our viewers. So I want to start with a clarifying question on some of the data that James was discussing. This is from Ian Chong with Carnegie, China. And Ian asks, do you have a sense of what respondents are reacting to when they claim to be exclusively Chinese or both? Do they mean Chinese culturally, ethnically, or in terms of being a citizen of the PRC or the ROC? Do you have any indication of what these terms mean? And then what proportion of respondents see themselves as Taiwanese, as Chinese both, or don't know?
So the question that we ask that is translated as Chinese, the response to the question, do you identify as Chinese, Taiwanese, or both? So the word Chinese in Chinese is 中国人. So it's not Huarren in a cultural sense. It's not Hanren in a racial or ethnic sense. It's 中国人 in a political sense. And what people mean by that, so we don't have any kind of follow-up questions to ask people how they understand the meaning of the phrase 中国人. So I'm afraid I can't answer that question without just kind of speculating about what might be going on in the data. Sorry, what was the second part of the question again?
If you have numbers for what proportion of the respondents saw themselves as Taiwanese, as Chinese, or both.
So roughly speaking, across both multiple ways of both our survey and other surveys such as the National Chengchi University's survey, roughly the proportion to identify as exclusively Taiwanese is around 60% or so. And then I think about 20%, 20 to 30% say that they're both Chinese and Taiwanese. And the proportion that say they're only Chinese is, I think, usually under 10%.
It's about 4%. Yeah.
4%. Yeah.
4%.
And one second part of the question from Ian, I don't think the data will speak to this, but interested if you have thoughts. He asked, for respondents who see Taiwan and China as the same country, do you have a sense of what China they're talking about? How many think this is the PRC, or how many might actually be referring to the ROC? Or like what is your assumption about the underlying kind of political connotation of those responses?
So we ask a follow-up question about what, if you think Taiwan and China are part of the same country, what is this country? And the modal response, as I recall, is a formulation of the KMT platform of saying that for Taiwan is the Republic of China, for mainland China, it's the People's Republic of China. And so that's a kind of a phrasing of the 1992 consensus. But very, very few, I think usually under 1% would say that Taiwan is part of the People's Republic of China. So the 99% of our respondents don't believe in Beijing's One China principle.
Great. We have another question from Sayun Oh with the University of South Carolina. And they ask whether U.S. military involvement elsewhere in the world, such as recent strikes on Iran, or there have been similar conversations about Venezuela, would strengthen Taiwanese perceptions of U.S. deterrence credibility, or would it raise concerns about strategic distraction from the Taiwan Strait? Is there anything in the data this year that would speak to those questions?
I'm afraid not, because we conduct our survey in January when Iran attack was not implemented. So,
but after Venezuela.
Yes, but we did not ask question about this right now. Yeah, so I don't think we can infer that based on our data, but we might have some insight from our other participants.
So our data can't speak to that, but what that question makes me think of is how in the national security strategy, there is a section, I mean, not even talking about the Indo-Pacific specifically, but it's talking about globally, that this administration sees itself as having a predisposition to non-intervention. And I mean, you compare that with what's really happening on the ground, and it seems like U.S. policy is not really following that principle. So I think that if you only looked at what's written on paper of this predisposition to non-intervention, you might be concerned that the United States may be less willing to use military force to defend its allies and partners. But I think, if anything, the recent events would indicate a greater disposition to use force in response to major crises.
That's a great point. I mean, I might extrapolate. I'm inclined to extrapolate maybe in the other direction, though recognizing, we're kind of reading tea leaves out of the data. But, in thinking about the question of distraction, I think some of the data David was talking about what kind of U.S. engagement or messaging is reassuring to Taiwan in terms of U.S. commitment. It seems to be that signals of U.S. focus on Taiwan do make a difference. So you wonder if even just, certain U.S. leaders, even putting aside the operational dynamic, being explicitly rhetorically focused in other parts of the world, does that have a corresponding negative effect? Just as a possible way of interpreting the data. Any other thoughts on this before we have one more question? Yeah.
Yes, I think if you think that our data couldn't answer the questions, but if you see our previous wave of the question about the U.S. signals, it seems to me that actions speak louder than words. If you only have words, you are obviously you make people to guess whether you are intend to intervene or not. But if you put your force on the grounds. And then if you try to intervene in certain scenarios, and then of course that people will probably think that well, by projections that could be applied to the same case in case of there's a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So I think the recent events obviously show that American is not generally it's not isolationism. Right now, it's more like to proactive, and that could be another signal that to Taiwan that if U.S. would like to be more active, then probably in general Taiwanese people would think that the U.S. security commitment could be realized into the actions, and that's the important signals itself. Although it's indirectly inferred from the recent events. As I said, our data cannot really explain or cannot answer that questions.
Sorry, if I could just jump in as a kind of follow-up to what David just said. So this didn't register at all in the U.S. press, as far as I can tell, but people noticed in Taiwan that at the start of the Iran conflict, Marco Rubio said that the U.S. was in the process of unleashing Chiang Kai-shek. And that is not like a trending phrase. It's something that is very specific to people with knowledge of Taiwan security. So I think that was a signal that the U.S. is not like distracted by other regions. I think that was a kind of a subtle signal that the U.S. is still prepared to defend Taiwan.
And there's a fantastic legend behind how Rubio came to use that phrase that I wish we had time to talk about. But next, you can do a whole event on unleashing Chiang. So to our next question, we have one from Paul here with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And he's asking about One China, One Taiwan, which is a policy that Beijing often accuses the United States of maintaining to undermine Chinese sovereignty. And so he asks, would it be correct to say that DPP supporters effectively do have a One China, One Taiwan policy? And what do they believe the U.S. position is on that issue? Does the data speak to that?
Well, what the data do speak to is that DPP supporters are much more likely to think that the U.S. considers Taiwan to be a country under its existing One China policy. But it depends on how you define One China, One Taiwan, right? So that could be a policy of de facto treating One China, One Taiwan, or it could be changing the status quo. And our data only can speak to what U.S. policy under the status quo is. But there is a clear partisan difference that KMT supporters think that U.S. policy is to say Taiwan's undetermined, and DPP supporters think that U.S. policy is to say that Taiwan is a country, or to believe that Taiwan is a country. Sorry, you're muted.
Thanks. Our next question is from Anita at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She wants to dig into the TSMC data and says that she's curious whether the survey captured any views among DPP supporters about the strategic logic behind TSMC's overseas investment in the US. So why do people see it as reinforcing U.S. security commitments to Taiwan?
Hsin-Hsin is for some reason she was not able to be staying with us. So but I will answer for her. So as we can see, so I think for DPP supporters, they are more supportive of TSMC investment in the United States. I think that's also part of the second version of the email loan. So I think some people think that the TSMC investment will increase the economic interdependence between Taiwan and the United States. So that's why they think that TSMC investment actually will increase U.S. likelihood to help Taiwan, as indicated by this figure. So we have been asking this question since 2025, and you can see that for DPP supporters, they have a strong belief that the TSMC investment will actually increase the U.S. likelihood to help Taiwan. So the increase in here indicates by those green bars. But for the KMT supporters or the TPP supporters, yeah, they are skeptical about the relationship between TSMC investment and U.S. likelihood to help Taiwan. So I think that, yeah, that corresponds to one version of the U.S. dependence argument.
Yeah. We have time for just one more question, and we have one from Ashley Lee with Commonwealth Magazine. And I'm really glad that Ashley wrote in because she's asking about polarization, which is, of course, a huge part of the story that we're seeing in this data, in that there is massive polarization between DPP and KMT positions on really critical issues related to Taiwan's security. And that may not be a shock, but it is interesting to see how stark it is in the numbers. And also, to some degree, how consistent it is over time. Because I think there's a sense that polarization in the current moment has reached sort of a fever pitch, and I wouldn't say that's not true. But there's actually a little more continuity than I maybe would have assumed. But so Ashley's question is, I take it that Taiwan is getting more polarized across party lines. What does that imply, and what impact could that have going forward?
Yeah, I will start first because I think my team member have other thoughts. But I think, yeah, polarization is a salient issue in Taiwan right now. But what we are puzzled is about how those polarization will spill over to the national security issues, because yeah, Taiwan has a constant threat from China, and then we see that partisan polarization actually also drive people's perception on different national security issues. And I would say that one issue is about U.S. strategic ambiguity, because now the U.S. government did not make its policy clear. So that's why people may have skepticism about U.S. actions or intentions, and that's why it makes room for those polarization to intervene in those thoughts. And that's why, we can see some polarization along those national security issues. So that's my take on this question, but I'm not sure about others.
I might just add this as a brief footnote that actually in some ways the data isn't as polarized as you might think. And so as I mentioned earlier, 99% of the respondents in our surveys don't agree with Beijing's one China principle. And what we find is that even though there is a partisan difference in terms of how Taiwanese respondents see this status quo, there isn't this sharp divide that you might intuitively guess based on what you see in the news, that that KMT supporters think Taiwan is part of China and DPP supporters think Taiwan is a country. Actually, it's not as divided on the status quo of Taiwan's sovereignty as you might think. So even though there is a difference, there is still a strong consensus against Beijing's one China principle, and there is a belief. We didn't present a lot of this in our presentation because there's a lot of extra data, but there is also a fairly strong consensus in favor of the status quo as involving some combination of Republic of China, Taiwan. So I think that there is actually quite a lot of consistency across the respondents in the data.
Great. Well, we are very close to out of time, but I just want to give each of our panelists an opportunity to weigh in with one concluding thought, if there's anything that we didn't already address. So let's start with Wen-Chin.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I would like to clarify that. Yeah, I just thank you for all the comments, and then I would like to clarify that actually polarization is not as serious as we thought, because in our data, as I mentioned in the beginning, we still have about 30% of nonpartisan supporters. So I think they are very critical regarding Taiwanese politics. So although we have 30% of supporters for the DPP and about 30% for the PEN group camp, but we still have 30% of non-partisans. So in that sense, I think, there might be some room for change in Taiwanese politics. I hope so, but thank you.
Great. James, any last thoughts?
Just making a very general point about why we do this kind of research is a lot of these findings are really counterintuitive and quite surprising. I presented the results for the questions that I kind of contributed most to for designing the survey. And the results were really surprising to me in terms of how Taiwanese respondents see one China policy, one China principle. I think that this kind of research is really helpful for understanding what people really think. And it's not the kind of thing that can necessarily be inferred based on intuition or what political, like higher elites would say about Taiwanese politics.
David, you got the last word.
Well, I would like to add 2 points. I think my presentation simply showed that if you talk about the policy signals sent out from the U.S. governments, the presidential statement are equally important as the congressional bills, which means that if the president somewhat walk back to certain statements, but the Congress actually puts some more assurance, then for Taiwanese people, they seems to be good enough to be reassured about the U.S. commitments. And secondly, I would like to add in my presentation, I think it's very interesting to see that the threat perceptions of Taiwanese is not necessarily associated with the credibility of the country. I think it's in fact it's associated negatively with the credibility of countries. So when people see that China's threat increase, they are more likely to think that this country is less credible. It's not because that China is a credible country threat to attack Taiwan that people believe that threat. Is because people do not believe that China is a credible country that actually lead them to think that they were more likely to attack Taiwan. By contrast, I think the security commitment is pretty much associated with the pre-existing or general trust in one country. Like when you trust the United States as a credible countries, and of course that you will think that their security commitment is more likely to choose. So this is a very, very interesting findings, and of course that we are doing more analysis by controlling the party ID, as Wen-Chin already mentioned, that our party, our data is loaded with a lot of partisan divide, and we need to control the partisan effect. See whether that kind of the conclusion can be held. Is not a spurious effect.
Great. Well, thank you so much to the whole panel for the exceptional conversation and the insights. The 2026 American Portrait Survey is now published. We have a link to the American Portrait Survey page in the event page. So however you got to this conversation should also get you to the data if you would like to dig even more deeply into the really interesting findings from this year's work. So thanks again for tuning in. Thanks to our panelists, and we hope to see you at another CSIS event very soon.
Thank you very much.